You can introduce yourselves, your school. If you have a designation for your team, please make that clear because the judges will need to know once we flip the coin.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm from Calvin High School.
Play-Doh team.
Play-Doh team.
Play-Doh team, grade 12.
I'm Bella. I'm Bella. I'm a little sick, and I'm in grade 11.
DT, grade 12.
Julian, grade 12.
For Jocelyn, and I'm also in grade 12.
Okay, thank you, Calvin.
My name is Emmanuel Shabu. I'm in grade 12 and I'm Fort Richmond Collegiate.
My name is Lindley. I am also in grade 12.
Sanchi Kaushal, also in grade 12.
Martha Simply, I'm also grade 12.
Progressive fines. Finland has found a creative way of trying to curb speeding. Instead of imposing a set fine, authorities base the penalty for speeding on the driver's disposable income. A record of annual income is used to determine a quote-unquote fair fine for the speeder. The richer you are, the more you pay. This system aims to equalize the punishment associated with violating the speed limit and make sure that everyone feels a similar amount of financial quote-unquote pain. Could a progressive system for fines work in Canada? Should the rich pay more if they're caught committing any number of non-criminal activities like speeding, fishing or hunting out of season, liquor violations? Would people be likely to accept a system in which there are different rates of pay for the very same violation? Would such a system be too complicated? Tax collection is progressive. For those who have more pay more. But fees and fines are traditionally applied equally to anyone who violates the rules in question. Fines that are merely inconvenient for the wealthiest citizens may pose significant punishments for those living on a tight budget. Economic constraints can easily lead those who cannot pay on time to become drawn further into debt and potentially even into court. The spiraling costs of this struggle to comply can overwhelm household resources, derail plans, and devastate well-planned budgets. For the most fortunate, in contrast, fines and fees are potentially so easily managed that they hardly work to deter rule breaking. Dutch rapper Lil Klein posted on Instagram that his wealth alone allows him to do what he likes and, quote, eat fines for breakfast, end quote. His comment implied that rules may apply to him equally, but their application doesn't really matter to him. Should we consider alternate ways to make sure everyone is at least sufficiently deterred from being reckless and breaking rules? While some view a progressive system of fines as a great way to create equity among those that get caught, others fear that applying progressive fines is unfair to the rich because it treats equally socially disruptive activities differently, depending on the wealth of those involved. Our justice system is predicated on individual equality. Can monetary punishments ever uphold this principle? How could progressive fines potentially change the way that people feel about the rules, regulations, and shared responsibilities to maintain public order? Pass those, you'll just have to share. We're a little parsimonious when it comes to presenting first on this question. You'll have 2 minutes to confer and then 5 minutes to present. Reminder, please, everybody else is quiet all the time. Only the conferring team or presenting or commenting speak. Okay, now that we all remembered, wait, just do my little thing here. I know. Okay, you're ready to start. 2 minutes to confer. You may begin. You may present. You'll have 5 minutes. I'll give you a heads up in 3 and 1. Please start.
Thank you, moderator. So what we would say to this question is that the issue of progressive fines touches on what is often a basic tension in the legal system, which is between 2 different schools of thought. One is a school of thinking that states that basically justice should be blind and following a Kantian logic often in the way that it's applied by legal theorists now. The belief is that justice should reflect fairness and everyone should be treated evenly, no matter what their level of wealth or whatever their race or religion or whatever other factors might be involved. that justice works when we treat people as rational individuals first, beyond their position in society. And progressive fines effectively will change this because progressive fines treat individuals differently based on their level of wealth. What progressive fines are doing is they're pushing the legal system more towards an equity-based understanding of punishment, that punishment should reflect the impact that it would have on the person accused if they're found guilty, and to elaborate more on how this tension plays out and what our position will be, first we'll have
Thank you. This relates to the question of punishment. What is a punishment for? We might view it as merely like some kind of pain for doing and infringing on some kind of statute we hold dear in society. That might be treating people as free moral agents who have committed a wrong and thus must receive a punishment. But there are other ways of seeing punishment too. It might be as a repayment to the community. We can see with littering, often accompanied with a fine. The fine might just be the cost to remove more litter from a park. These fines can act as ways to fund our processes that restore a kind of social order in society. We also have races as protected classes. We have race as a protected class in Canada, and other features like gender, sex, and religion as protected classes that shouldn't be entered into the calculation when deciding punishment. Blind justice would lead you to believe that class is also shouldn't be considered when considering the punishment given to people. To expand on how equity might change this view, Sarah.
Thank you so much, NT. You know, our team is looking at a mainly equity-based punishment in these sorts of scenarios, and this allows for us as a society to become more empathetic. Weekly, I go on walks with Mama Bear Clan, and I see people living on the street who are in deep need of feeling seen. They survive by using drugs or stealing because of the trauma that they've experienced in their lives, and they feel unseen by the justice system. And when we understand this, by giving them a little more grace in the justice system, we will recognize the struggle of marginalized individuals, and we allow them to feel represented in this justice system by using things like restorative justice. And with that, I'll pass it on to Bella.
Sorry, just to jump in real quick. What Sarah's just explained is the basic value that we see equity can have. And so we respect the views of people who believe very strongly in blind justice and the views of those who feel that equity is important. And we feel that there is a balance that can be reached between these two, which Bella will expand on.
That balance looks like a base fine cost applied blindly to everyone. There would be room for people to appeal on the grounds that a fine might be disastrous to them financially. People in dire financial situations for whom a $200 ticket would inhibit their liberty to eat for a month, for example. Similarly, recurring offenders would have an exponential increase in fine costs, preventing people like Lil Klein, as the case points out, from eating fines for breakfast. So in summation, our stance would be to provide a base fine with room up for recurring offenders to prevent Lil Klein's approach to fines, and room for people living below the poverty line to not have their freedoms inhibited upon. I'd like to pass it off to Jessalyn to conclude.
Thank you, Bella. So to address the question, the progressive fines is a system of equity, and this changes many things, such as our justice system, which is based off of blind justice. As Sarah mentioned, progressive fines can also change the way we view people, especially in a court where there might be a more empathetic system. And so our own position on this would be to create a system in which blind justice and equity can be combined and implemented together. And by doing so, we can give judges the leeway who would be able to determine the appropriate punishment or the appropriate punishment for the people who have these fines. And this is able to consider people who don't have the means or are struggling. Thank you. We look forward to hearing your response.
Thank you. On the button. Thank you very much, Team A, for your presentation. Judges, please score Team A. Team B, you may get ready to do your commentary. You have 1 minute to confer. You're conferring already now. Time for your commentary. Team B, you may begin.
First, we would like to start off by, I really liked hearing all your points, especially when it comes to equity versus equality. My question is, how does this change in the fine system affect the economy as a whole?
My question for you, great points by the way, how would you deal with judges that were accustomed to the old system, that may be more biased towards that system in terms of like wanting more blanket fees and therefore lower fees for the rich and comparatively higher fees for poorer people?
I completely agree with you guys that when pertaining to fines, especially that we should move to more equity-based system. But as we all know, some people may argue that equality is one of the pillars of ethicalness in its originality. So should we start reconstructing what we see as ethicalness and what is ethical in itself? Because in cases like this, equity trumps equality, right? So.
I'd also like to bring up the point you made about how oftentimes fines are seen as given back to the community, such as with littering fines. It's very great that you brought that up because it's another way of thinking about these kind of financial burdens. Now, one question I have is, are you sure that the rich would also see this as giving back to the community since they are the most heavily affected by progressive fines? Additionally, I think it's important to compare Canada's tax system to Finland's tax system when, with regards to tax efficiency, as that really does define how implementable a progressive tax system is in Canada. Would Canada's tax system's efficiency affect the way people think about progressive fines, and how would that be? And finally, there have been other equitable systems implemented in Canada before that have received negative backlash, probably the biggest one being the carbon tax, even though that is also an equitable system based on your carbon footprint. How exactly would progressive fines be taken differently than the carbon tax when they're both equitable systems?
Have you completed? Okay, thank you very much for your commentary, Team B. Judges, please score Team B on the commentary to Team A's presentation. Team A, you may prepare your response. You have 1 minute to confer.
Well, to address this point about equity and equality, as we understood this question, coming back to this idea about the relationship between people and public order, and the way in which people feel about the public order and their duties to uphold it in relation to the law, progressive fines would change the relationship that people have with the law, because it would change the understanding that people have about how the law is applied, in that it would shift towards a more equity-based approach to the law. And so that's absolutely right. The original belief among many people that laws applied equally would be challenged, basically, by progressive fines, which is why we feel that because of the importance of equality before the law, we wouldn't go all in on progressive fines, and we would find this balanced approach where there's more leeway given to legal systems to move up or down depending on a whole host of different factors. And I'd like to pass it on.
Thank you. Another question was about the carbon tax and how that might be viewed as a progressive fine. In fact, we think that's probably not necessarily a progressive fine. It doesn't take into account someone's race or gender or anything like that. Applying those principles of equity, it is on their actions, and we're judging them on their actions that they take to produce carbon emissions. It's not necessarily in the same way a progressive fine, but we believe that kind of fine can be applied very usefully in Canada to support our economy and behavior.
Lindley, you mentioned judges that might be biased towards the old system. We were thinking for this middle ground approach, an application system might be more feasible, where people would be able to not do a full court appeal for lowering the cost of their fine, but rather submit their net income and wealth as metrics for reasons why they might need their fine lowered.
Yes, sorry, just really quick jumping in on the point about economic impact and efficiency. And we really appreciate that you brought this up. And this was something that we hadn't fully considered in our discussions. It's an interesting extension of this notion of progressive fines. And we would say that many European systems have a much more efficient state apparatus, and that would make it easier for them to apply this sort of a program, which is why we feel that we need to expand resources in the legal system more broadly so that we can implement our approach. And then Sarah would like to expand on some of these.
And just really quickly jumping in, you asked about how the rich can see that people are giving back to the community. You know, they will see the punishment that as giving back to the community, as they will be, as a lot of restorative justice includes people doing community service who may not be able to pay the fines. So this public service will be able to serve our community, and the rich will be able to see that they are benefiting from this. It's about education. Like, they are able to see that they are benefiting from these punishments that people are, well, punishments, but public service. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. Oops. Okay.
I'm sort of here where you think you want to go, a balance between justice is one and the equity system, but I'm not sure I heard in MARL intents and purposes, practical, on the ground, what would it look like? I know, Julie, you talked about a host of factors that would influence, but what is that? What would it look like on the ground if you had that balance system?
So what that would mean essentially, and I think you can also expand on this a little bit, as an example of a way in which we might consider different factors. If someone is, as Bella suggested, below the poverty line, if someone's unable to pay a fine, then they would be able to appeal on those grounds. They'd be able to say, this is something that is beyond my means, and that even a $50 ticket can ruin people if their finances are deeply strained. And so if someone is absolutely financially unable to pay for a fine, that should be something that should be taken into consideration. And it actually harms this equal for the law principle less, to allow for some room for people who cannot afford to pay to actually be able to get out of those fines, so that they won't be completely ruined by what we would consider broadly to be a pretty minor type of offense. Like, the types of offenses that you're being fined for typically are summary offenses, and they're not serious threats to public order. And so the factors we consider primarily would be financial for someone looking to reduce their fine.
On the other side,
And I just double, so what's the deterrent for people who know they won't have to pay any fine? Is there a punishment?
Well, again, the deterrent is they're still paying some fine. It's a reduction.
So some,
It's something within their means. They're still getting some.
you know,
on the other side, it would be a richer person. There can be rich people who commit these offenses, and even it being on their license is enough to discourage them from reoffending. I know, like, personally, a fine might not be the end of the world, but it would certainly discourage me from continuing reckless behavior while driving or any kind of offense like that, because there are other pressures, not just the fine. It's not just financial pain, but it's having it on your registry, having maybe family members. There's public pressure also not to endanger the lives of others, and having something on making people aware that you are committing these dangerous things is sometimes a disincentive. But there are people who might continue just because all they care about is the financial punishment, might just eat it for breakfast like little Klein. And for those people, judges can take a look at the character of the person, the nature of the offenses, and the severity of reoffending, and up the fine until they stop.
Building off of what Julian said, we would use certain metrics like, for example, the poverty line to determine when, automatically, when people should have X amount of reduction on the fine. There will be cases, though, where someone does not meet any metric quality that is needed to get a specific deduction, and that might be an instance where someone needs to go before a court instead of just an application based on certain criteria.
So one wonders, get into a more complex system of balancing all of these things. Is the real purpose to increase safety? In other words, get more people to drive at a right speed and safely? Or are we trying to create a system that gets very complex in this process?
Again, this speaks to a tension in the case, and a tension in the way we look at fines. And we do see that fines are important as deterrents. We want to use them as disincentives effectively to stop people from doing things like speeding. But in general, the way that we consider fines is as a lesser punishment than jail time. And the crimes that are fined typically are not as severe as indictable offenses, where you might end up in prison for a long time. And so we see that fines are a very useful disincentive, but they should be applied in a way that makes them merely a disincentive rather than a ruination for someone who cannot afford to pay. And in terms of the system, how a system like this might work and how it could function a little bit better, again, this would have to come with a major increase in resources for the courts. And in many of these applications that we're talking about to have fines reduced would hopefully go through an initial process that doesn't involve going before a judge, that just involves an application to a clerk who could review, and we feel that if we expand the amount of staff involved in that system, it wouldn't create an overly complex, it wouldn't overly complexify the legal system. It would just make sure that we're considering some of these equity concerns while also maintaining the disincentive value of funds.
Your question, oh, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so you've kind of reviewed, there's more burden in this more complex system, but you think that's gonna result in more safety? Like, is it worth the difference?
Right. We feel that we do care about safety, but for us, what we're primarily trying to address is the equity concerns. And safety is absolutely important, which is why we don't, as we mentioned in the previous question's answer, we don't want to remove fines entirely. We want to make sure that they still provide a disincentive. But it's, again, we want it to provide a mere disincentive rather than a serious hindrance on someone's ability to live their life freely. We just want to recognize that fines can be a serious impediment to someone's right to security if they're unable to pay for their rent because they've been fined. That's not something that we really want. And so the safety question is important. It's just not so overwhelmingly important that we want to abandon equity concerns.
Your question kind of wraps around the central issue of this case. I mean, I have at the top of my paper written what is the purpose of fines. That's very much something we talked a lot about. And I think we feel that the purpose of a fine is to dissuade, and this system does not detract from that purpose. It, however, provides, or rather removes, the potential of a fine to ruin somebody in certain financial situations.
We wouldn't want to have people trust the legal system less. We wouldn't want people to see that they're less safe because fines aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is why it's so important that we do this carefully. We try to find a balance that doesn't completely remove that disincentive.
Moreover, practically, having increased fines for richer reoffenders might add more cash flow into the system to help finance these increased costs of managing all these different applications.
And by punishing reoffenders more, that could improve safety in some key ways. People who consistently drink and drive and then pay the fines off because they're rich and it doesn't matter to them are a serious danger to public safety. So that could be a way that we could actually improve safety.
Okay, so, one of your arguments is moving towards equity. Now, one of the things you haven't really quite touched on is just also equity in people receiving fines. So, there's been a lot of issues in Canada and the US looking at police and certain communities disproportionately be monitored. So how do we, if we're talking about, equity and equality, we can't really just look at fines. We also have to look at who is receiving more fines and how would you look at addressing some of those issues related to racism within the justice system?
We feel that blind justice is an important principle of our legal system, and progressive fines tend to sacrifice blind justice for more of a class-conscious justice. Paying attention to racial factors is something that we can't ignore the racial factors, but in the spirit of blind justice, we cannot distribute fines disproportionately as a result to equitably balance injustices in our legal system. There are better ways to go about fixing them.
Yeah, and just to expand a bit, so my understanding, what you're getting at, like there's an example, black people are just about as likely to smoke marijuana in the United States as white people, but they're twice as likely to get fined for it. And so what we would say is that in ensuring equity, that is an issue around policing. And so what we would need to do is we would need to ensure that policing is done in a more balanced and fair way, and that we incorporate different approaches into policing that include an ear towards equity. So we would have potentially more training for officers, although training is not something that can solve the problem on its own. A more useful way that we could increase the equitability of the policing system is by allowing for more diversity in hiring in police, and also adding specific officers to police departments who are responsible for de-escalation, and adding back an element of community policing to the way that we conduct enforcement.
Just adding on, ensuring that there are programs, as Julian said, around training. Professor Negon Sinclair has gone and done different workshops in policing, and it's shows that education has real power in this scenario, showing that showing policemen that there can be equity in our system is important to them.
One last point is that race, unlike class, is a protected class in Canada. So that's one place where we cannot allow this disproportionate policing just on a constitutional basis. That's an enshrined right to be treated equally, not on the basis of race, but on the basis of behavior. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, judges, for your questions, and Team A for your answers. Judges kindly score Team A on the responses to the questions. I will collect any papers belonging to these. City sidewalks and libraries are all spaces designed for use by the general public. But how we design and share public spaces may not work well enough for everyone. How a space was intended to be used may not settle how it is actually experienced. Cities can struggle to maintain and regulate public spaces in ethical ways that meet everyone's needs. Ideally, no one feels unwelcome or unsafe in a public space, but many sometimes do. There is a specific population of people who experience public spaces in a unique way, those who live in them. How do we respond when someone's choices about how to use a public space make someone else feel unsafe or uncomfortable? Cities across Canada confronting growing issues with homelessness have worked to develop clear policies around sleeping in public spaces. In 2015, the BC Supreme Court ruled that effectively preventing unhoused people in Abbotsford, BC from sleeping in public spaces was a violation of their rights to safety and security. This ruling prioritizes the safety and liberty of those who choose to sleep in public spaces. Across Canada, though, critics have expressed concerns. Allowing established tent camps, for example, may negatively impact the overall value, accessibility, and security of public spaces. Living alongside tent camps may also create unique and challenging ways to experience public space. Municipalities, those being cities and towns, create and enforce the bylaws governing who gets to use public spaces and how and when. Cities are responsible for their design, maintenance, and public safety, and must design whose safety to prioritize and what measures that requires. How could we build more ethical communities through the design or regulation of public spaces moving forward? Your discussion question is, sharing public space. How might the ways the rich and the poor interact within a city matter to that community's potential to address poverty? You will get 5 minutes to present, 2 minutes now to confer, and Team B, you may begin conferring now.
Depends on perspective. Of course, the people who own businesses are the rich people in question, and they might find a problem with poor people or, for example, homeless people being in their space because they'll think things like, oh, well, it might lesser the value. But then it poses the question, why are we putting value on human beings themselves? Why are we not valuing the equality of the issue? And when we think about who gets to use a public space, or in an issue like this, we need to understand that the idea that some people are entitled to a public space is an issue that is a product of colonization in itself. Rich people should not get to own places. We should not get to own land, and everyone should be entitled to the space that we have.
I would like to bring an example that is very relevant. This morning, as we all came into this building, some of us were here quite early, and we noticed that the locks of this building were closed. Now, when this was brought up, somebody mentioned that it was because the university had started doing it because homeless people often come into the university during the nights to sleep. Now, this was a hindrance to many of us in this room right now, but imagine the hindrance it was to homeless people who didn't have a place to stay for the night. If seeing homeless people in these public spaces is an eyesore to us who are much more privileged than them, maybe that should be a push for more shelters and housing for the homeless folk rather than pushing them out of the space. Just because they are not visible in these spaces does not mean they're not there.
Another perspective to look at too, which relates to the ethic of autonomy, is property value and how poor people interact with the properties of rich people. Because many people who are very wealthy don't just purchase a single property to live in, but also purchase additional properties to sell off later for profit or even rent out. Whereas poor people who live around those properties may reduce their value. And the reason that also affects a community's potential to address poverty is now it takes the financial aspect into the conversation and the rich people's autonomy to pursue greater profits. It starts to bring up the question, can we still allow for profit? Or is looking for profits through poverty value something we should even be considering when you think about how we address poverty?
It's also important to note that places where rich neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods are more heavily separated often leads to the wealthy not realizing that poor people even exist in their communities. And a lot of the times, these separations of these two neighborhoods can be done purposely by the government. Like if we think about the history of like redlining, and that intersects with issues of race as well.
Yeah, and when we think about the demographics that make up the low-income community, especially in Winnipeg, we see that they are overpopulated by Indigenous people and Black people. And one of the 94 calls to action pertains to the overpopulation of homelessness, and that overpopulation of Indigenous people in homelessness. And I think that by addressing the issue of building people homes to live, like just taking care of our neighbors and making sure that everybody has a place to stay, like maybe building community homes. And with that, we will be able to address the issue of poverty.
I think we should be prioritizing people's lives over profit.
Yeah.
And just to add a number to what you said, 29% of the homeless population in Canada is Indigenous.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, TV, for your presentation. Judges, please score TV. You may get a chance to comment on TV's presentation. You'll have 1 minute to confer and 3 to present. You may begin confer.
Thank you, moderator. Thank you for your presentation. We, in our discussion, thought about how the ways that the rich and poor actually don't interact, especially in democratic processes. So we were wondering how we should include homeless people in the crucial decisions that affect the ways they live, especially in processes in which they interact with the rich.
Strong divides between rich and poor neighborhoods can distract from these democratic processes. Things similar to the Portage and Main opening versus staying closed issue had a lot of people not in the area with a democratic say, and that skewed the results of the voting. That would be a good example of when rich and poor people have a different say in the democratic process. Also, you guys talked about land ownership, and you guys said that there should be no land ownership. Do you think that that's something we should apply to everyone? Would you advocate for a state-run no personal land system?
One other element is you talked about the profit motive of rich people, but that's not the only way they interact with poor people, especially when they're together. I think there is an issue sometimes where they feel unsafe in communities where there's a lot of homelessness, because with homelessness comes crime and drugs. These things are often correlated, even if it's not the individual fault of any given homeless person. How do we deal with these impacts that come along with homelessness without attacking homeless people? Another is about defensive or hostile architecture. Often passively, we discourage homeless people from existing in public space, and it's not so noticeable. How can we make sure that homeless people are comfortable and are able to access public space when they need to sleep there?
And just to add a bit on that, so you discussed the ways in which the rich and the poor don't tend to interact, and in particular the ways in which the wealthy and the homeless often don't interact. And we felt that interaction across classes was one of the key ways that we could raise awareness and build support for programs to address poverty. And so for us, we're just wondering if there's a role that public education could play, extending a bit to the field of education in facilitating relationships between people of different social backgrounds, such that they're able to see each other's perspectives in a way that allows them to know and support programs to address poverty. What role does public education play there? And I think Sarah has something to add.
Yeah, just quickly adding on, your team talked about how you want to create more shelters for homeless people or people who are living on the streets. How do we make these shelters more visible in our communities? And how do we make them more effective too? There's a shelter in the North End right now, it's Sunshine House, down Main Street I mean. And it is one of the most dangerous places in the city. It allows people to recover from drug addiction, but it is one of the most dangerous places in the city for women. So how do you address that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That again, okay. All right, judges kindly score Team A on their commentary to Team B's presentation. Team B, you get a chance to respond to the commentary. 1 minute to confer.
So much for those questions. It really helped us think about how we approach poverty from the perspectives of liberty, autonomy, equity, and utility, and of course virtue, as we think about things like democracy, safety, and other ways we benefit our community. We'll start off with the first question, like how do we include the poor in democratic processes, which are often middle class and rich dominated? And there are a couple models we can look at essentially. Thank you for bringing that up. And one way is through supporting charities that already help poor people with these kinds of things. It helps us think. We were talking about how we should support charities that already build homes for homeless people, but now we're thinking maybe we can also support charities that help them navigate legal and democratic processes like Main Street Project. Oftentimes, democratic processes and legal processes are difficult to navigate, and charities like Main Street Project have people on the ground to help homeless people navigate those processes, like secure the proper identification necessary to participate. So thank you for bringing it up, because now we think in addition to our model, we could also support charities that provide that service so that the poor can participate in democratic processes.
Something to add to that is that I feel like something that people seem to dismiss is that we can also have conversations with homeless people or people who do not have homes at this time, and ask them what changes they would like to see in our community. And by doing that, we include them in our democratic processes. Also, we would also need to reflect on the attitudes that we have, the way we see homelessness. Why do we see homelessness as something that's dangerous? Why do we see homelessness as something that is of lesser value? Or where do these attitudes come from? And by doing that, we might just get to understand each other more. And when it comes to public education and how that might help, in Norway, they got rid of privatized education, so everyone goes to the same public school, rich and poor people alike. And I think that if we do something here in Canada like that, then that would mean that everybody gets to experience each other. And basically.
What I really think is the most important thing that we should all remember is that homeless people are just people. They deserve to have their voices heard, they deserve to have dignity, and they deserve to be treated with respect and to be safe in their communities, whether or not they have addiction problems or anything else.
And finally, to address the topic of safety, there's actually a number of things we can do that already in practice. You mentioned that oftentimes charities are seen as safe zones for homeless people. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Firstly, because they have cameras. So if something happens to a homeless person, you have that evidence to support them because there are cameras. So one way we could support safety is by supporting charities and camera zones so that homeless people have places to stay away from places where they're still safe.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for your response to Team A's commentary. Team B, judges please score Team B. Then we'll move to judges' questions.
One of the things that you had mentioned is the importance of giving to charities that are supporting individuals that are homeless. What about holding governments accountable for taking responsibility for citizens' human rights?
I think that we should hold our government responsible, and also pay attention to how our government allocates the funds and the tax money for different public services that we have here in Winnipeg. I had a presentation being done to my feminist club about women's health centers in Winnipeg and how they haven't gotten a raise in funding since the 1970s. And I think that that's absolutely atrocious. When it comes to these services that help the people, and especially people who are in poverty, they are not given as much funds as things like police services, let's be honest. So I think that we should allocate more funds to that.
And to show an example of how that allocating funds to homeless people does actually work, in Vancouver, they did a pilot program where they gave 50 homeless people $7,500, and at the end of the study, the municipality of Vancouver, the Vancouver government, they had a net savings of $700 per person.
We agree with holding governments accountable because they are the ones who should be servicing us rather than the other way around. So to answer your question, yes, we should be holding our governments accountable. And I think so far we have not been doing the greatest job at it, but I do believe that we're improving, and I see a rise of improvement in our future.
And ways we could do that is send emails to the people you know that are in government. Send emails to your MLAs, send emails to people you know can make a difference in the world. Not only that, but hold them accountable on their promises. If they say they're going to do something and they don't do it, then that shows that they don't actually care about their promises and they should not be elected the next time around.
Thank you. BC, the province of BC has become a really interesting testing ground on this notion of public spaces. Recently, when the Supreme Court quashed a BC legislation that people could not inject illicit drugs in public spaces to save people's lives they were dying in the opioid crisis. But that has created a lot of problems for parents taking their kids to the playground while perhaps seeing a person injecting illicit drugs or having to deal with paraphernalia and needles on the ground. So those two tensions are incredible to think about. So how do we mitigate those two forces, sort of caring for the compassion of people who are poor, living in poverty, who have no safe place to inject drugs, versus the need of the public for a safe environment?
I completely understand what you're saying, but I think I pose that we can use instances like that for means of education. I think that if we start showing, like, just educating people, especially children and just people in our society, that there are others who need different care than we do. And by doing that, we might reach that empathy piece that we talked about.
I think if anything, this shows that we need to have a push for safe spaces to be doing these drugs, safe injection sites, for example. And if we see this as a problem in public areas where children are, I think safe injection sites is a much better solution, where these people with these drug problems can be safe. Yeah.
There's actually a number of ways we could even do this. So one thing that ends up being very important for homeless people who are unfortunately addicted to drugs is Narcan, because that can help bring people back from when they're high, when they're particularly overdosing. Now, there are a number of charities that have that on them, which is why they become a safe space for homeless people to be a safe injection site, because if they do go under, then there's a way that they can be brought back. Now, in order to make sure that these kind of activities don't occur in places like children's playgrounds, we can sort of use architecture as well as these kind of injection sites to create a sort of incentive system. Now, first of all, if we have these safe injection sites where it's more favorable to be at if you are unfortunately addicted to drugs, which isn't something you can easily control, then there's at least a place where you are incentivized to go, which is away from those children's spaces. That's a passive system we can implement in order to have these kind of activities away from those areas. And then if we still need some more pressure, then hostile architecture isn't a particularly empathetic way to do it, but as long as people have a place they can go, then it's something that's still useful to implement in, say, playgrounds, for example.
So woman Karen Armstrong did a bit of a TED talk on compassionate cities and how do you create inclusive spaces. And as you're trying to walk through that, one way is education, maybe around compassion and that thing. And there's just how do you build community. So can you speak about whether educational or even events or how you build community together?
I think we would still focus on that education piece, but also building empathy. Put yourself in my shoes and not put yourself in yours. If we show people the conditions that other people might be facing or the way that other people might be living, then we can get closer to each other and see that we don't have to see our system and see our society in this individualized way, but see ourselves as a community. Like, I help you, you help me. And I think that that's what we should be striving for.
I think I was going to add to that, but just so I make sure I understood the question, would you mind saying it again? Repeating your question, just so I make sure I understood.
So I'm just saying, I think what we talked about is creating a more inclusive space where people can work together. So what are the tools that we can use? Education, are the community building events, does Folklorama represent community building event? I don't know.
I think we should also look for stories as well from people, because oftentimes there are stereotypes associated with homeless people, like they're uneducated, they're dumb. But what we find is a lot of homeless people are actually extremely educated. When I was working over the summer, for example, I worked at Agape Table, which is a homeless organization here in Winnipeg. A lot of our guests who came for food had master's degrees, had worked in education for decades, but they'd unfortunately fallen homeless due to, say, an injury, or they didn't have enough money after retirement, or their families abandoned them. Understanding these stories can help break down those stereotypes. And so we could, for example, look to public speakers in our community, or bring people into schools to talk about their experience, public events as well. Sharing these stories would be in a very effective way to build a more empathetic environment, because it would break down the stereotypes and really show how we end up with this problem, because it isn't so clear cut as, oh, a person gets high on drugs. There's a lot more to it.
We have 2 minutes. Does anybody want to elaborate? Or we can?
Adding to what Matheson said, it would also be good for us to have nuanced conversations. Like he said, it's not very clear cut. Everyone's experience is different. Not every homeless person is going to be the same. And there are also intersections that go into that. Are you a woman? Are you a person of color? And by understanding the complexities of that, we also will reach a better future.
I think it's also important to, just like, especially in the education system with like children, to really teach them that even if somebody is dumb or hasn't gone to school or whatever, that doesn't mean you should treat them any worse. They're just as worthy of your kindness and respect as any other person.
It seems like a very good place to end. Thank you very much. Thank you both teams.
Like, honestly,